Let's try to simplify something today that's actually very complex. Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today we're going to talk about the touch DNA that was found on the button snap of the knife sheath that was discovered on Maddie's bed. There's a lot of talk going around right now about this DNA. But before we get into this video, I want to let you all know that we are going to be talking about the Travis and Jamelyn Jutin case, as well as the Sandra Ladd case. I know that I haven't made a lot of videos recently about these two cases, but they've taken me down this long, winding road. My research, along with a lot of the information that I've gotten from a lot of you all, has taken me down this road. And I think y'all are going to be surprised about how many violent crimes are committed almost exactly the same way, in very close proximity, with a sharp-edged object, multiple victims, and the intruder sneaking in at night. Not to mention, all of these crimes are unsolved. No persons of interest, no suspects, no arrests. So I've been going down this road and trying to piece this all together. And I think y'all are going to be pretty surprised about the information that I'm going to share with you this week. But today, I want to talk about the touch DNA on the knife sheath on Maddie's bed. I want to talk about it in more simple terms. I am not a DNA expert, and I've never claimed to be. I'm not a scientist, so you're not going to be hearing a lot of big scientific words in this video. But I do understand how DNA is used in investigations as well as trials. So let's talk about this touch DNA that was found on this knife sheath that was discovered on Maddie's bed, according to law enforcement. Now, I'm not going to go too far back into the whole story about the knife sheath, because I think we all know that touch DNA was found on the button snap of the knife sheath that was found inside the crime scene. But I do want to talk about the actual touch DNA. Now, we know that it was a very, very small amount, minuscule, and it was made up of skin cells. So when investigators pulled this sample of touch DNA off of the button snap of the knife sheath, they ran it through the CODIS system. Now, they didn't come up with a match. So what they did was they took this sample and they submitted it to a genetic testing company. The same type of genetic testing company that consumers use to submit their DNA to learn about their ancestry and also possible medical histories. It's very possible that whoever this DNA belonged to had never committed a crime, so they would not be in the CODIS system. So after the FBI takes over the DNA investigation from Idaho State Police, they begin forming a profile from the sample that was left at the crime scene. And what they do is they begin searching databases from these genetic testing companies that are used by the public. They also begin constructing a family tree in hopes that they can find a family member and then basically use the process of elimination to narrow down a suspect. If y'all remember in the very beginning, Bryan Kohberger's neighbor at his apartment in Pullman, Washington, did an interview, and he stated in that interview that Bryan Kohberger had talked to him about genetic testing. He had mentioned that he was interested in it and that he had submitted his DNA to learn more about his ancestry. So it's very possible that Bryan Kohberger's information, that his profile, was in one of these databases that the FBI was searching through. But in my opinion, it's still kind of sketchy as to how they were pointed in the direction of Bryan Kohberger. And we'll talk about that. So in my opinion, and this is what I believe happened, law enforcement needed a more solid connection between Bryan Kohberger and this touch DNA sample that was found on the knife sheath inside the crime scene. So, to me, it seems as though they would have been able to get this DNA from Pullman, Washington. I feel like they would have been able to get a DNA sample from Bryan Kohberger while he was still in town. But they don't do that. Instead, they decide to follow Bryan Kohberger in hopes that they can collect some sort of DNA. Now, this is just my opinion. So they followed him and his dad 2,500 miles to his parents' home in Pennsylvania as they were driving across country for the winter break. Now, I know there's a lot of debate about whether law enforcement was following Bryan Kohberger and his dad or not, but I believe that they were. I don't believe that the traffic stops in Indiana were coincidental. I don't believe that somebody gets pulled over 2 times in less than 10 minutes for following the car in front of you too closely. In my opinion, law enforcement was gathering Bryan Kohberger back up because I believe they lost track of him. So after they all get to Pennsylvania, to the Kohberger house, and I say all of them, meaning Bryan Kohberger, his dad, investigators, and whoever else was following along, investigators begin going through the Kohberger's garbage, which is set out on the curb. So basically, they pull out a piece of trash, and after it's been processed, they determine that the touch DNA on this piece of trash belongs to the father of the DNA that was found on the knife sheath. So they basically create a connection. So what they do, and this is where it starts getting shady again. So what the FBI does is they call in a tip to investigators, letting them know that there's a connection between the DNA that they found on the trash that belongs to Bryan Kohberger's dad and the DNA that they found at the crime scene on the knife sheath. This is basically the connection that they need to secure an arrest warrant. So they storm Bryan Kohberger's parents' house and they take him into custody. Now, when Bryan Kohberger is arrested, they take a buccal swab from inside of his mouth in order to collect his DNA. They take this DNA and they compare it to the crime scene sample. And according to court paperwork, it's a statistical match that it belongs to Bryan Kohberger. So it was determined through comparison between the DNA that they collected from Bryan Kohberger when they arrested him and the sample that was at the crime scene on the knife sheath, that it was Bryan Kohberger's DNA on the button snap of this knife sheath. But what we don't know is where this knife sheath came from. We know that law enforcement found this knife sheath on the bed, partially under Maddie, it's been said. But we don't know where that knife sheath came from. That knife sheath wasn't found until the afternoon on the day that the crimes occurred. So we don't know how that knife sheath got there or when it got there. We only know that law enforcement discovered this knife sheath and it was taken into evidence. Nobody can say with 100% certainty that this knife was not inside the house when the assailant got there, that this knife didn't possibly belong to one of the roommates. There's no way to say with absolute certainty that the assailant brought this knife into the house. It's not uncommon for a weapon to be taken away from someone who's trying to defend themselves and used against them. It's actually a lot more common than people would think. I just don't believe that whoever committed this crime just left the sheath to the weapon that they committed this crime with right next to one of the victims. I don't believe that someone who is capable of taking 4 people's lives with a single knife, as law enforcement believes, and then walks away uninjured and doesn't get caught, would leave the accessory to the weapon that they used at the scene. I just don't believe that someone with this type of experience would do that. That's just my opinion. Regardless, we know that the knife sheath was found inside the crime scene. We just don't know where it came from. It could have come from one of the roommates. It could have come from a friend. Maybe somebody left it there. We know that these students like to take pictures with their knives. I don't feel like there was any shortage of hunting knives in this area. So it's very possible that this knife was already in the house, and I believe that to be true. I'm not saying that's a fact, but I believe that this knife was already inside the house. You know, if we were talking about the touch DNA being on a larger object, let's say a refrigerator or a bed frame, then in my opinion, that would be more solid, because nobody's going to come in and just drop a piece of furniture or an appliance in just some random spot. But a knife sheath is meant to be carried around. It's light, it's portable, it can be concealed. So in all actuality, a knife sheath could be dropped anywhere. It could be brought in from outside. There's a million ways that this knife sheath could have entered this house if it wasn't already there. Now, I've seen a lot of people comment and discuss that once investigators had an actual DNA sample from Bryan Kohberger's buccal swab after he was arrested, that the IgG didn't even matter at that point. But in my opinion, the sample that was at the crime scene is the most important piece of evidence that we're aware of so far. Way more important than a video of a white Hyundai driving around the neighborhood. Even if it was proven that it was Bryan Kohberger's car caught on video driving around the neighborhood, that still doesn't put him inside the King Roadhouse. It just basically proves that he was driving around the area. So in my opinion, the IgG is very important, because once you have Bryan Kohberger's DNA that they collected after they arrested him, they have to have something to compare it to. And they would need to compare it to the IgG, because that was the actual DNA that was inside the crime scene. In my opinion, the IgG is very important. Investigators used this information to secure an arrest warrant so that they could take Bryan Kohberger into custody. So if the IgG is not on the up and up, then that's a problem, because then how did they secure that arrest warrant? We know that they went in and arrested Bryan Kohberger after they received this tip from the FBI about his dad's DNA. So in my opinion, you can't just disregard the IgG. It's significant. I'm all for any technology that can help law enforcement solve cases. But in my opinion, I still feel like this IgG was shady. The prosecution didn't include it in the PCA. They didn't want to include it in evidence, because basically they said, we already have Bryan Kohberger's DNA that we collected from him when he was arrested. But the IgG still needs to be used, because they still had to compare Bryan Kohberger's DNA that they collected from him with the sample that was at the crime scene in order to tie the two together. So, in my opinion, that's kind of where things got shady. And like I said, I'm all about technology that can help law enforcement solve crimes. But I still believe that if you're going to use this technology, you still have to show your work. You still have to show how you came to this conclusion. And as we know, there wasn't a lot of documentation from after the FBI took over the DNA investigation. Basically, they were doing all their work inside of these profiles, in these portals that were on these genetic testing websites. When Bryan Kohberger was arrested, they erased all those profiles. So basically, all their work was erased. So as I said, I'm all for technology. But we have to remember that technology can be used in good ways, but it can also be used in bad ways. So it's important to show your work and show how they came to this conclusion. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I hope that y'all have a great day, and I'll see you next time.